The Eastern Front of World War II remains unnoticed and spoken over, often by feats of heroism and liberation brought by the U.S. Army in World War II, at least in the Western education system. Along with that, the vast devastation wrought upon Eastern Europe by the Nazis is often looked over. However, such a thing is common in America. As Joseph Stalin said, "The death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic." At face value, the statistics brought by such an event are overwhelming, almost inconceivable. It is estimated that 24 million citizens and soldiers of the Soviet Union died in the Second World War. To visualize that, 15% of the population of the Soviet Union died at the end of a barrel, the blast of a shell or bomb, the lack of food or water, or crippling disease. Even greater, however, was the ability of the Soviet peoples to crush the fascist hordes, rebuild homes and factories, and come out still seethingly unscathed. German-Soviet relations were a murky affair in the lead-up to Operation Barbarossa, or the invasion of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, as well as other world leaders, were not blind to Adolf Hitler's buildup of Nazi Germany. It was known that communists were actively targeted and executed within Nazi Germany, and it was obvious to both parties that the ideologies of Nazi fascism and Soviet socialism were almost completely diametrically opposed. Joseph Stalin believed that Hitler's expansion would not stop at Czechoslovakia, like promised in the Munich Conference. A series of mutual appeasement treaties were signed between the Soviet Union and Germany, most importantly, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The pact outlined the condition that both countries were not to make alliances against or work against each other. There was, however, the secret protocol, which also outlined what was considered to be each country's sphere of influence, in which they would disallow each other from annexing said sphere, primarily splitting Poland between the two. The secret protocol was, of course, a state secret held by both nations, evidence of its existence only coming out when the Nuremberg trials were held. These treaties relaxed Joseph Stalin's worries about German invasion, so when it was becoming increasingly clear that German invasion was imminent, Stalin was confident that Hitler would uphold his part of the pact. He did not. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, creating the largest military theater the world has ever seen. 3.8 million Nazi personnel were deployed to the Soviet Union throughout the course of the invasion. It is here that the devastation we speak of began, with German bombers beginning assaults of Soviet-occupied Polish cities. It took 11 hours for forces and the people of the Soviet Union to finally be fully alerted and mobilized, with the radio broadcast by Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov declaring the German invasion and that the Red Army and the whole nation will wage a victorious patriotic war for our beloved country, for honor, for liberty. Our cause is just. The enemy will be beaten. Victory will be ours. Adolf Hitler also declared the invasion after what is probably about 5 minutes of perambulatory rambling, claiming that the Jewish Bolsheviks worked in collaboration with the British and were skirmishing into the German border and could only be pushed out after hours of heroic fighting by the Wehrmacht. This is, of course, a lie. Whereas Soviet forces were in fact positioned near the border, they did not make some sort of expedition into German territory. We of course see similar claims made throughout history to justify the horrific actions of nations, foremost in the modern day being WMDs in Iraq and Ukrainian attacks on Russian forces. The destruction and incitement of mass casualties was instilled in the German war plan from the start. The primary goal of the invasion of the Soviet Union was the implementation of Lebensraum, or a land for the Aryan peoples to thrive and to naturally dominate the surrounding peoples. The land would be subject to ethnic cleansing, where non-Aryans would systematically be starved and killed. Then the land would be colonized by Germans, a process similar to American Manifest Destiny, wherein the native populations of America would largely be replaced by the descendants of British colonists. One manner in which the Germans would go about destroying the native population was the Hunger Plan, where the food produced in the Ukrainian region would be completely routed to the German army, starving Soviets and solving logistical issues the Germans faced in their invasion. The plan proposed to kill a total of 30 million civilians if occupation were to prove successful. However, the plan was never fully implemented, as it would require complete control of the agricultural sector of the Union. While the Nazis got close, they never completely did. Still, many millions died of famine in German-occupied areas of the Soviet Union. The plan was specifically implemented against Soviet POWs, where those who were unable or refused to work were denied food, being provided a 700-calorie-a-day ration, almost entirely consisting of bread made from sugar beet husk. Almost all Soviet POWs would die of starvation by the time they reached concentration camps. Those who did survive would be forced to trade dignity for grass and leaves. Other POW lives were at the whim of the SS, who were encouraged to shoot certain types of soldiers on sight, specifically female, Jewish, disabled, annoying, intellectual, and fanatically communist soldiers. On top of that, a 1941 decree made it legal for any Wehrmacht soldier to shoot POWs at his discretion. For POWs housed in concentration camps, it would be worse than executions by shooting. For example, in Flossenburg concentration camp, POWs were burnt alive. In Gross-Rosen, 65,000 were starved by being fed a strict diet featuring only a soup made of water, grass, and salt. In Majdanek, executions would be held by throwing soldiers into mass graves and shooting the POW after he had fallen onto the bodies of his comrades. A town in Austria, Mauthausen, complained of water contamination because the river that ran through the town was red with the blood of up to possibly 500,000 POWs. In 1941, in Auschwitz Gas Chamber 1, the SS would test for the first time Zyklon B, the primary instrument of mass murder, on 600 Soviet POWs. They would be found successful and would be implemented further in concentration camps. Atrocities in the Soviet Union would not be limited to POWs. The Einsatzgruppen, literally operational groups, was one of the single largest perpetrators of genocide in Eastern Europe. The Einsatzgruppen were SS battalions that would follow behind invading forces, collaborating with local fascist elements to identify and eliminate Jewish communities, Soviet officials, and hospitals for the physically and mentally disabled. The Einsatzgruppen would round up civilians, walk them out of urban centers to rural areas, strip them of all clothing and valuables, force them to dig mass graves or large pits, line them up against the edge of the pits and shoot them, falling inside. It is estimated that the Einsatzgruppen is responsible for the deaths of 1.5 million Polish and Soviet Jews, or a fourth of European Jews killed in World War II. Nazi leadership, however, was unimpressed by the inefficiency of mass killings by rifle, as it was incredibly expensive. Soldiers had to be paid, bullets had to be produced, transportation across the entire Eastern Front. The Einsatzgruppen also attempted killings through carbon monoxide vans, which would drive victims to mass graves using the van's exhaust to asphyxiate those inside. This practice was not widely implemented, however, as mass killing by rifle was preferred for its simplicity. Another major method of mass execution was the use of killing centers or concentration camps. Civilians would be transported by rail to concentration camps where a selection process would be undergone. Jewish men of specific professions would be spared to perform menial and specialized labor. The rest would be killed. The most well-known method, Zyklon B, as stated earlier in the video, would not be used until 1941. Prior to that, killings would be performed by firing squads. Zyklon B is a cyanide-based gas that was invented as a pesticide in 1920, but of course not adopted until 1941 for use as a chemical weapon. Gas chamber killings led to the death of approximately 1.1 million European Jews. In total, 11 million died as a result of the targeted killings of the Holocaust. In many of the post-Soviet states, the Eastern Front is not called the Eastern Front, but the Great Patriotic War, and it originated in the Napoleonic Wars, specifically the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. The term reappeared after the German invasion in Pravda, a major state newspaper. In my opinion, I think we should adopt it as well when referring to the Eastern Front, as it's a great representation of the true nature of the defense of the Soviet Union. Great being apt, as it still or as it was and still is the largest theater of war to have ever been fought, and patriotic, representing the absolute tenacity of the Soviet peoples in the defense of their motherland. The Great Patriotic War had rushed the Red Army to the outskirts of their very capital, left almost the entirety of the Soviet economy in shambles, literally, and decimated the population. For those of you in America, a visual aid. Here we have a map of the Soviet Union at the height of the German invasion. That's a lot of land, but it doesn't mean much to us. Now here's us. The year's 1944. 3 years ago, the Germans landed in New York and Washington, D.C. New York's immigrant population has been brought upstate and killed. The people of Rochester, New York, are being starved. Skirmishes happen occasionally, but casualties are still in the thousands. Plantations across the South are either burned or now fed to the German invaders. Louisville, Kentucky is demolished following one of the largest tank battles history has ever seen. Heavy industry has been dismantled and moved across the country, from Detroit to Denver, from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to Los Angeles. The men and women of Birmingham who escape ethnic prosecution form partisan groups to fight Nazi occupation. Most will not see the end of the war. St. Louis finds itself in a state of block-to-block attrition warfare. Citizens have been evacuated. The city has been reduced to rubble, but the Germans press on for the propagandistic victory. Now on the map, there are actual parallels we can draw to the invasion: Detroit to Moscow, Rochester to Leningrad, and so on and so forth. The invasion of the Soviet Union led national GDP to drop by almost 40%. The occupation led to Nazi control of 60% of coal, iron, and aluminum production. On top of that, the agricultural sector was slashed by 40%, with 60% of livestock being killed. Much more industry would have been lost if it weren't for the efforts of industrial relocation. Beginning in 1941, the GKO, or State Department Committee, began the dismantling and relocation of 1,500 militarily important plants to cities closer to the Ural Mountains. This was largely possible due to the Soviet Union's extensive rail system, and the fact that it's really just the transport of machinery. It's not like they're picking up the whole factory and dropping it in some village, as one might imagine when they hear the phrase evacuation of a factory. Each factory's evacuation was carefully planned and timed so as not to hinder the factory production until the moment of evacuation. This was done by organizing the machinery into categories of how difficult it would be to disassemble and reassemble. The harder it is, the earlier the machinery is moved. In some cases, factories would remain in operation dangerously close to the front line. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union lost almost one-third of the Union's wealth in assets, cities, rail, and farmable land. What there was no lack of, however, a goal. The Union's industrial capability by 1945 was almost entirely militarily focused, consumer goods being produced in low quantity at a low quality. So for the central planners of the Soviet Union, it was clear that consumer goods need to be produced again, all while still maintaining the Union's military industry for the sake of defense against the capitalist powers residing in the US and UK. In an effort to ramp up consumer good production, part of the army was demobilized alongside major budget increases to the civilian industrial sector. Over 6,000 heavy industry plants were built in the first 5-year plan that followed the end of the war. The plan largely focused on heavy industry rather than the agricultural sector, a trend of the Stalin regime. Yet the 5-year plan was still largely successful, increasing heavy industry production, coal, steel, etc. by 73% beyond pre-war levels. It cannot be doubted, however, that it was aided by war reparations paid by Germany and Japan, as well as confiscated machinery and prisoner of war labor. In terms of population, however, the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states simply never did recover. There was a strong imbalance between men and women after the war, as most killed were young conscription-age men. The 1959 census revealed that there was approximately 18.5 million more women than men in the country. Efforts were made to curtail this gap, unfortunately at the cost of personal freedoms. Whereas Lenin had made the Union one of the first countries to legalize abortion at request by any woman, Stalin had decreed abortion illegal, and the Ministry of Health would withdraw contraceptives from pharmaceutical shops. The Soviet population would continue to grow until the fall of the Soviet Union. Nowadays, the population of post-Soviet states remains largely stagnant and even fell for 10 years until 2015. Other measures were also taken to reform working protections that had been temporarily suspended during the Great Patriotic War. 8-hour workdays were reinstated, along with annual vacation. During the war, factory workers were often expected to work up to 14 hours a day, a minor sacrifice compared to the young men of the Union may have had to give. The Soviet economy would recover to pre-war levels by 1940 and would largely remain stagnant until after the death of Stalin. Whereas some may be critical of Soviet reconstruction, failing to make any effort other than passive in the agricultural industry and struggling to recover population-wise, it is absolutely astonishing that a nation that was brought to its knees by one of the strongest armies the world had come to see and would still come out a superpower within 5 years of Victory Day. Thank you for watching the German devastation of the Soviet Union, or Staring into the Face of Evil. It has been 10 months since my last video, but I still plan on making more videos, so stay tuned. Remember to check out my other video if you haven't already, the Soviet War in Afghanistan. I'm sure it'll be hyperlinked right about now. Thank you.